All right. The role of health in cognition. Now, I've already talked a little bit about eating well and exercising and things like that to keep your brain healthy. Better predictors of cognitive ability than age would be morbidity, which we talked about in the last chapter, disability, and vitality. So, if you are a young old person, that is, the vast majority of people who are over age 65 who have, low morbidity, low disability, and high vitality. Probably along with that comes great cognitive ability. So we shouldn't just assume that a person's numeric age is the predictor of their cognitive capacity. Now, something I think I mentioned this before, and I kind of semi-defined it for you at the time, but just to reiterate, there's this term called terminal decline. This is where we see cognitive abilities declining in the weeks or months leading up to a natural death. The first time I read this, I was like, wait, I read it as leading up to death. And I'm like, well, wait a second. There are a lot of ways to die. How would your brain know to go through it only happens in, leading up to a natural death. And that natural death might have been boosted by something like cancer or something that, made it more likely that you're dying right now. But I mean, you still see this terminal decline that happens in the weeks and months leading up to a natural death. If you test an older person, years prior to death, you don't see terminal decline. It's something that happens very quickly in those weeks or months leading up to a natural death. Any other normal decline, not terminal decline, but other kinds of cognitive decline really can, you can compensate for those kinds of things through training. Terminal decline, you can't. It's sort of, as everything else in the body is starting to shut down as you're approaching death, then you have, these declines in cognition that are really clear. And it's really one of those markers that medical professionals can kind of use as evidence that the person's getting close to the end, things like that. So let's talk about some diseases that specifically affect the brain. Delirium. Delirium is something that is temporary. A younger person can have delirium, right? It's something that you can get from different kinds of medical states, psychological states. Drug use is probably the most common cause of delirium in younger people. But being dehydrated or being dissociated in a psychological sort of break, these kinds of things can produce delirium. You can get it at any age, but it is more common in the elderly because they have a harder time maintaining their fluid balance, their salt balance, like all the homeostatic things that bounce back so well during young adulthood. By older age, those things don't bounce back as well. And so you can have higher rates of delirium. A lot of times it manifests itself in confusion, dizziness, argumentativeness, combativeness even. So it's an altered mental state, but it's due to something temporary. Usually this is not like something that you now have. It's something that you're experiencing right now. Dementia, on the other hand, is irreversible. It's once you start to have it, you have it to whatever degree pretty much permanently. It's going to be due to organic brain damage or disease. So it's going to be, that's why it's permanent, right? Because with that damage or disease, the brain now is in a new condition. It's much more likely with advanced age. There are age-based causes of dementia. And so it's much more common with advanced age. So let's talk about delirium. Pharmaceutical delirium oftentimes occurs when we have what's called polypharmacy, where a person's taking a whole bunch of different medications, this one for their heart, that one for their diabetes, this one for their cholesterol. And by combining all these things together, they actually are getting an interaction that's causing the delirium. Malnutrition. A lot of times when people are older, they're like, I'm just really not that hungry. And part of why they're not really that hungry is because they're sort of sitting still. They're not really noticing that they're hungry. And so they'll oftentimes eat very little during the day. And then when they get dizzy and feel weak, they don't realize it's because they're literally hungry. Or it could be that they've been in this kind of chronically hungry state and they honestly are deprived of certain nutrients and and things that would keep their bodies in balance. Dehydration, really common cause of delirium, and probably among younger people. Illicit drugs are the number one cause of delirium in younger people, and then dehydration. You oftentimes see a person who's been out on a hike and it's too warm, and they're not experiencing heat stroke, but they're experiencing sort of dehydration. They can get delirious. Brain tumors can cause delirium. Pressure on the brain, pressure in different areas can cause delirium. And then other kinds of physical illnesses. Diabetes can cause delirium when the blood sugar gets too high or too low, different kinds of things. Lots of different kinds of physical disorders can cause confusion, dizziness, loss of awareness, that kind of stuff. All right, but I bet you've been waiting for me to finally get to Alzheimer's disease. I call it Alzheimer's with an apostrophe S. With the new edition of the text, they decided to take off the apostrophe S, and now they're calling it Alzheimer's disease. It's called the apostrophe S because the person who discovered this disease or first characterized it was a person whose last name was Alzheimer. So I guess I'm old school, but I call it apostrophe S. So the symptoms. You get a gradual deterioration of memory and personality. And generally what the type of memory that goes first is memory for recent things. You're going to notice that the longer term memories, especially like this picture illustrates, he's kind of remembering back, 70 years ago when he was a GI in World War II, right? That he remembers like it was yesterday, but he literally can't remember yesterday very well. He's having trouble with the recent stuff. And that's going to be due to the brain structures that are involved. And then personality starts to change. You may have a person who had been a very nice and easygoing and low-key person, and now they become really argumentative. You may see that the person is now getting very what's the word I want to use? Become sort of exhibitionistic, where they want to sort of flash people. They might become kind of babyish. I mean, there's lots of different ways that it goes as far as the personality changes. So why this happens is due to another symptom, which is some brain changes. Plaques and tangles are the key changes to the brain that are signatures of Alzheimer's disease. So on the left, we have, a normal brain with its neurons. And then on the right, we see amyloid plaques, which are little hard places in amongst the neurons. And then within the neurons, you see these neurofibrillary tangles. So there's like these confused tangles in the neurons. So it's quite tangled up. Let's look at how the brain changes. Here's a scan of a brain slice, and then whoops, where'd my other picture go? Oh, there it is. And then here's that same kind of area, but just drawn, so you can see it a little bit better. So on the left side is a normal brain. On the right side is a person with Alzheimer's. And what you can see is that there are areas of the brain in the person with Alzheimer's, like on the temporal lobe, where the memory area is not doing well. Just to get you oriented towards this brain, you've got, we're looking as if like their eyes are looking back at us. So we're currently looking at, on our right is their left hemisphere because they're facing us. So that's why you're seeing the language center over on the right-hand side of the person with Alzheimer's. So you've got the memory areas being much smaller in the person with advanced Alzheimer's. You're seeing the language areas being smaller with the person with Alzheimer's. Honestly, all around the cortex, you're going to see shrinking of the cortex in the person with Alzheimer's. And the ventricles, which are the open areas in the center of the brain, are much larger in a person with Alzheimer's. Some other brain changes. Okay, so this is what's called a PET scan. And what we're seeing is you've got a person who is on the right who has normal functioning brain and has tested negative for the presence of amyloid proteins. So this is a person without any evidence of any kind of Alzheimer's, normal functioning brain. In the middle is a person who's got normal function. There are no outward symptoms that there's anything wrong, but they are amyloid positive. And what you'll notice is that there's a lot more yellow and orange and red in that person than there is in the normal amyloid negative person. So even though that person in the middle is not experiencing any symptoms yet, you can see that their brain is working a lot harder than the person on the right. And then by the time we get to the person with Alzheimer's disease, obviously they're also amyloid positive, you see even more activity in certain areas, right? It's taking more effort in the person with Alzheimer's than the normal person who's amyloid negative to process the same information. So they're trying to marshal more of their resources. But then if you compare the Alzheimer's disease person to the normal amyloid positive person, you'll notice that there are certain areas in the Alzheimer's disease person where there's less activity going on. And that may be because now we've finally gotten to a point where there's enough atrophy of the brain that there just really isn't enough neuronal support to be marshaling enough extra resources to actually be able to compensate for the losses that the person's experiencing. Now, it's important to have early Alzheimer's detection. When I was a student studying like you are, they had no real way to be sure that the person had Alzheimer's. And so you kind of had to definitively diagnose it after death and do an autopsy. Now they can diagnosed while the person's still alive, which is good news because there are early treatments available now. There was one that was approved by FDA in June of 2021 that is supposed to reduce amyloid deposits in the brain. Now, there was a lot of controversy about approving this drug because it seems to actually reduce amyloid deposits. It does seem to do that. But in the study that they did, they were not able to show that it actually had any impact on the symptoms that the person might be displaying, or the study wasn't long enough to have any indication of what the long-term outcome might be. So there was a lot of controversy because they approved something that may or may not even really do anything, and it does have side effects. But it's something that hopefully in the long run will ultimately work. So just thought I'd throw that in there for you. All right, so now on the right, we're looking at, the comparison of a normal brain while doing some kind of task. So now you're seeing a lot of activity in the normal brain. And over on the person with Alzheimer's that's advanced, you see that they're trying to do the task, but they don't have certain areas to marshal. They've really experienced a lot of atrophy. There are some treatments available for people who have mild to moderate Alzheimer's symptoms. And so even getting diagnosed at the point where you're starting to show symptoms, the best place to get diagnosed would be if you are still behaving normally, but you're just amyloid positive. That's probably your best time to get diagnosed because then maybe we can slow the progression. But even if you're at the moderate stage where you are starting to show some symptoms, there are some medications that can slow the progress. They're called cholinesterase inhibitors. They don't reverse the effect. There's nothing that reverses the effects of Alzheimer's. Like once a person's brain has started to deteriorate, there's nothing you can do to reverse that. The only thing that they're hoping for is to slow the progression. Whoops, what happened there? There we go. Okay, so in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, what we're going to see is some forgetfulness. Which, see, that's such a horrifying thing to say, right? Because I just got done talking about how older people are like, oh, I forgot something. Everybody's forgetful. But forgetfulness like putting the car keys in the refrigerator or leaving your car running or leaving the stove on, which I did the other day, honestly, but I was really super distracted. In my defense, there were 3 cooks in my kitchen. So I don't know if I forgot or if one of the other 2 in there forgot. Okay, I'm making excuses, but forgetfulness, loss of verbal fluency, which I think we can agree I'm not having a ton of that problem. But with a person with Alzheimer's disease in the early stages, they'll have difficulty thinking of the words that they need to say to continue their sentence. They will have difficulty pronouncing words that they know, or and I don't mean the normal kind of stammering that we all do while we're searching for a word to complete a sentence. I'm not talking about that. It's I saw an older person being tested. He and his twin brother One had absolutely no symptoms of Alzheimer's and the other had a lot of symptoms of Alzheimer's. And they were trying to study these identical twins to find out, what role genes play. The one who was having Alzheimer's symptoms, he saw a picture of a hippopotamus and he was supposed to name it, and he couldn't think of the name of the item, even though he's looking at a picture of hippopotamus. Like most of us, if we saw a hippopotamus, we'd be able to generate the word. And he was really struggling, and he was describing everything there is to know about a hippopotamus, but he couldn't say the name. That's part of what we're talking about with the loss of verbal fluency. Like I said before, some personality changes appear in the early stages. For a lot of people with Alzheimer's, that early stage lasts a really long time where, they have like these little glitches, little bits of symptoms, but it's pretty stable, or they might even seem to get better for a little while. But that's just a moment. Alzheimer's disease always progresses. The memory loss can become dangerous. Like I said, leaving your stove on, leaving your car running. These are things that can be dangerous. It could be that the person actually loses sort of their cognitive map, and so then they are more likely to get lost. Those kinds of things. So it can become really dangerous. In the final stages, when the person is really advanced and we're past the possibility of like really being able to live on your own, because you have become kind of dangerous, right? At that point, you're going to probably need full-time care. A lot of people spend the last year of their Alzheimer's diagnosis really not talking or communicating. On average, a person lives about 10 to 15 years with Alzheimer's disease, with, from the onset of symptoms that triggered them to get diagnosed to death is on average about 10 to 15 years. All right. This is a good time to stop. I'll transition into another way that you could develop dementia, which is a vascular dementia. So I'll see you in the next piece.